Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Presence Machines, Creating a Sense of Connection Online. This webinar is taking place in the lead up to the OEB Global Virtual Experience, the cross-sector conference on technology-supported learning and training, which will be held virtually for 5 days from November 30th to December 4th. Our speaker today is David White, Head of Digital Learning at the University of the Arts London, and keynote speaker at our upcoming event in December. We're very happy to hear from him today and get a first taste and feeling of what you can expect at the conference, where he will speak in a plenary on Friday together with Barbara Wasson. So the conference will offer an opportunity for exchange on a global level, just like this webinar, where we have participants from all continents and 57 countries registered. So from Chile to Namibia to Singapore to Australia, a warm welcome to you all. As we all know, never has the need for best practice in online teaching and training been more pressing than today. But can we design presence and social connection into our online spaces? Amongst others, Dave will share his insights into this, as well as into student and staff experience of emergency remote teaching. At our virtual event for 5 days early December, we will go into more depth into these themes. So during this session, please feel free to contribute to the conversation by sharing your questions in the Q&A panel on the right, and the chat function will be turned on as well. Now, before I hand over to David, I would like to ask you to follow OEB on social media. We use these channels to keep you up to date with conference news. In the handout panel on the right-hand side, you'll see the relevant links, as well as how to register for the event. Please do take a second to click these and give us a follow. Now let's get straight to the part you've all been waiting for. Over to you, David.
Oh, thank you. I'm just going to go back one. So this is me. I'm Head of Digital Learning at the University of the Arts London, which is a really large university based in London that's focused around art, design, communication, media, business. What I'd like to do is start by encouraging you, there's a little note there, just encouraging you to chat in the text chat as I'm speaking. I'm very happy for people to make comments, talk to each other just as I'm going along, and if I see something interesting, I might respond to it. If you've got actual questions that you'd like to ask that perhaps we'll be able to get to at the end, then put them into the Q&A feature. Hello, Jackie. So there you are. See, I responded to somebody straight away. And Marin. So what I'd like to do is start with a quick question just to get our brains moving. And this is the question, and I'd like you to respond to it in chat with whatever, you know, there's no right or wrong answers. So the question is, what do you think people have missed the most when studying 100% online? So type your answer into the chat. There's a few people chatting now. Eye contact is the first one there, which I think is that's deep. Laughter. Oh, it's a little bit sad, Martina, but there we are. Socializing, contact, personal connection, loads of things coming in now. This is great to see. Engagement, social contact, personal contact, socializing, having coffee, informal learning, social contact again. This is great. I'm not going to keep reading the smell of others. Okay, I get, yeah. Why not? It's great to see so many people responding. One of the reasons I like starting with a question like this is because you can see as you see all of these things coming in, you get a feeling that we're actually here with other people. Whereas if you hadn't typed anything in, it's just kind of a bit more abstract. So thank you for that. Keep those coming in and keep chatting away. What I'm going to do is come back to that in a second. Okay. Support there. Looking around the room to find new people to talk to. That's, yeah, interesting. So I'm getting I'm really interested in your answers, and what I need to do is start. So what I want to do is just really open, and as I say, keep chatting away, because it's nice to see that. With this idea, so I work at an art and design university, and we make a lot of things. You know, there's a lot of creative arts practices where we're making things in studios, working collaboratively, and there's this sense of the material or materiality. So I just want to start by saying, you know, I really miss that. I think all our students do. We need to remember that we're very online at the moment because of a pandemic, not because we all love being digital all the time. And there's only, there are limits to what we can do with digital with materiality. Now, having said that, a lot of our courses have been doing amazing work with redesigning assessment so that students can actually do their making work with materials they can find from home and then sharing that. So actually, there's still an awful lot of learning that you can do in that regard. And of course, our buildings, I've called them presence machines. So there's an interesting question you can ask. What's the point of our buildings? Sometimes we don't ask that question because we're just so used to them being there. Now they've disappeared, suddenly we're thinking about them. And I'd argue that the point of a building, especially an institutional educational building, is to allow us to be co-present with each other in one way or another. They are presence machines. And the digital environment has lots of different forms of presence. And that's something that I'm going to be exploring today in the talk. But often when it comes to teaching and learning, that presence doesn't come for free. So if you're sat in a lecture theatre, if you're sat in a physical room with other people, then you're embodied, you're in your body. And so it doesn't matter how bad that session is or what happens in that session or what doesn't happen, or even if it's just silent, you're going to be sat there feeling like you're there with other people. Whereas in an environment like this, if I hadn't asked that question, if people aren't putting the cameras on, then if it's silent, it's like you're on your own, okay? So I think that's really important to acknowledge that buildings are presence machines. We've spent hundreds of years designing them to create that sense of co-presence. And we haven't spent hundreds of years designing our online environment necessarily to create that sense of presence, not necessarily in a teaching and learning sense. I think social media is quite close from that point of view. Machine might not be a good analogy for environment, but I don't know. I'm gonna say I work at an arts place, so I'm allowed to play with language like that. But it's a reasonable point. So we are very attached to our buildings, and to the extent that when lockdown hit, certainly in the UK, where we pay fees, students pay fees, about £9,000 a year. There was this question, why should students pay full fees even if universities are shut, right? Now, this was from May. This made me quite cross because my point was our universities aren't shut, the buildings are shut. Actually, the teaching carried on because of the digital environment. And I just wonder whether we really acknowledge that. Now, one of the things, so this is me getting grumpy on Twitter about it, and somebody who works at my university responding back and saying, actually, no, we're working really hard to do the teaching. We got plenty of examples of where we got more engagement, where for certain students actually working online was more flexible, was better than face-to-face. But it's not a competition between face-to-face and online. We're very attached to our buildings, not just because we like being in them, fair enough, but our buildings become like a model of what it means to do education. So if I say to you school, if I say to you university, probably the first thing that pops up in your mind is a building, okay? And we model everything against that idea of building, okay? So even the digital environment, that's why you end up with things like this, which I think look sort of strange. So this is the new Zoom together mode. There are various versions of this in different platforms. And what you can see here is that we've immediately, almost desperately, tried to recreate our buildings in the digital. But the question we have to ask is, what's that doing from a teaching and learning point of view? I'd argue in this case, this is as much about surveillance as it is about learning. Now, it's going to depend what kind of level. Yeah, I'm sorry if my audio is coming and going a little bit. There's lots of technology involved in bringing us all together, but hang on in there. So, it depends what level of education you're teaching and what your responsibilities are to your students. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is about this one about practice mirroring, which is where I'm kind of describing the fact that when we go into the digital environment, our first instinct is to mirror exactly what we did in buildings, in the face-to-face environment, but digitally, okay? And so in the university sector in the UK, for every session that we had in the building, like every lecture and every seminar, we simply created a digital version of the lecture or the seminar in an environment a bit like this, right? And that became exhausting because it's actually a different environment. And one of the reasons it can become exhausting is because the sense of presence isn't the same. We have to operate on a different set of ideas of what we might mean by presence. And this is something that I articulated in this, I think it's like a 5-minute video called The Desituated Art School, where I asked the question, you know, what would it mean to have an art school that had no or virtually no physical spaces? What's the actual implications for that? What does it mean to learn? What does it mean to teach? Certainly earlier on in lockdown, and potentially we could be heading that way again, depending on where you're based, obviously, you know, we've actually been operating without a building. So we have to consider what we can do in terms of designing teaching and learning that really helps with this idea of presence, which isn't simply trying to recreate the building in the digital. I think one of the really useful sort of questions that becomes a kind of focal point for all of these ideas is the camera question. So can I just ask, actually, you can answer in the chat, how many of you, I don't know how many of you teach, so I don't know how many people are going to answer, but answer in the chat if you can. How many of you have done online teaching and hardly any, and maybe none of your students have switched their camera on? I'll just leave it a second. Have you been in that situation where you've been teaching? Ah, I see, there's tons of people answering, but I need to scroll down. Yes, no, yes, me, yeah, most do. Yeah, yes, I've experienced that. Right, that's great, thank you. I didn't see them coming in for a second, and I was worried that I was just here all alone, and I felt a bit spooky about it. But now I can see stuff flying through. So it's not an uncommon experience. Okay, so this is a very real version of what I'm talking. Yeah, only if I ask them. Yeah, there's somebody talking about if they know the session's being recorded, then perhaps that'll make them more nervous about doing that. Okay. So there's a really interesting thing going on here, which is to do with motivation to engage. So a lot of my research is about motivation to engage. What motivates students to engage in the online environment with teaching and learning? And you have to ask yourself the question, what's the advantage to the student in switching their camera on? And here's my answer. I mean, feel free again to put your answer into the chat. I'd be interested to know. But my answer is, unless the students understand their education as a shared endeavor, as a communal thing, then they won't necessarily put their camera on because they won't see the benefit of it. They won't necessarily see the benefit to themselves. But if you can get across the idea that it might be a benefit collectively, obviously, if we've got this idea of our buildings and that practice mirroring principle in our minds, then I think what's going on is we start, say, an online teaching session in one of these kind of environments, and nobody puts their cameras on, and it feels odd because we're used to looking out at a sea of faces, and if we can't see the sea of faces, how do we know anybody's there? Okay, great, thanks. There's somebody else called David who agrees with me. So the David posse is the global David posse. One day, us Davids will form an army and take over the world because there's a lot of us. It's also about GDPR. Yeah, absolutely. So that's, I think, I can't remember how, that's a European legislation to do with data protection. So absolutely. So it's really interesting because the question, I think what we're looking at here is clearly used to being in physical buildings, not digital. So what's happening is, I believe that our main way of deciding whether people are present is if we can see their body or their face. And if we can't see their body and or their face, then we feel like maybe they're not really here. I'd argue that that's a false, that's not a really good measure of whether somebody's present. It's just a measure of where their body's somewhere. And actually, we need to be thinking about presence in terms of actual engagement, which is a difficult thing to measure. So let me just set this up. I've got a poll question for you now, and I'm just going to start the poll and leave it running for a second. And I'd like you to respond to the question, because I think it's quite an interesting, hopefully you guys can see that now. I'm not massively, so people have started answering. I mean, you know, clearly I was well aware that putting "it depends" in a poll for an audience that was even anything mildly to do here was a really silly thing to do, because the answer to everything in research is "it depends," which is fair enough. I'm just going to leave that open for a little while longer, because I'm getting percentages, but I don't necessarily know exactly how many people have answered out of everyone. But that's slowed down now. If I close the poll, I'm not sure if you guys see it or if it disappears. So I'm just going to read it out. We've got yes at 41%, no at 11%, and it depends at 49%. Come on, guys, make your mind up. No, it's fine. It's fair enough. My view, I'm going to close that poll now. My view is that actually, you know, a camera's into students' private space, most likely. There are data protection reasons. I'm actually having an interesting discussion with our legal department at the moment about educational video as to whether being able to see the color of somebody's skin allows you to understand their ethnicity and therefore is protected data. So it gets pretty complex. So I think my answer to that question is yes, students should have the right to not have their cameras on, which is where I'd reiterate the point that if we want them to put their cameras on, we have to create trust, we have to create that safe space, and we have to articulate the reason why that's of value to their learning, to what they're trying to achieve. I think sometimes, you know, when our buildings are open and we're just in the flow of what you could call our normal mode of teaching and learning, sometimes we don't explain these things because actually quite a lot of what we do is implicit. So for example, why is it worth coming to lectures? Why is it worth doing independent study? Maybe we do articulate that, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just assume that coming to lectures is self-evidently a sensible thing to do. So I think when things go digital, it's all the more important to be explicit about why we've asked our students to do a certain thing in terms of how it benefits their learning. Now, it sounds trite, but it's easy to forget to do. So, and then we end up with things like the camera question, where we actually, you know, are surprised that students aren't turning their cameras on. Yeah, so somebody's talking about alternative options. Yeah, so how do you develop, and there's somebody else who's talking about how do you develop that intrinsic motivation to see their uni education as shared. And I think that's a central question, especially at university. And I wonder whether we do as good a job of that as we could do. And I wonder whether the pandemic has sort of highlighted that. You know, in the end, we're ranking institutions. Pretty much all educational institutions are. Everybody gets a mark. Everybody gets ranked. It becomes separated. You know, everybody's individualized. A lot of stuff about personalized learning. I think I'm more interested in communal learning. Obviously, there needs to be a balance. But I think that being in the digital environment raises some of these questions. I closed the poll, so don't worry. The answer was broadly undecided or yes. So this eventedness is related to presence, and it's a word that myself and Dave Cormier, I wanted to call him Dr. Dave Cormier then, but I know he's still doing his PhD. He's only just started, but in my mind, he's like a doctor. But we came up with this phrase a while ago, and the word means the extent to which you felt like you were at an event. Okay, so a really top tip from me is when you're designing a piece of teaching and learning that's going to be online, probably anywhere, but let's say online, ask yourself this question: could it have been a YouTube video? If the answer is yes, then you have to ask the next question, which is, so what's the point of turning up live? Okay, students might as well watch a recording. There's always a little bit of contention around lecture capture on this, which is if I start lecture capture, then attendance will drop. Well, I don't think the research shows that, but even if that was the case, it's because students know that they're not going to get anything more out of attending live than they would do watching the recording. So I think in terms of, if I think about the answers to that first question, you know, where you were saying, a lot of people were saying connection, you know, that feeling of belonging, co-presence, I'd call it, then I think that synchronous moments of teaching need to be designed, have that connection and social presence designed back in. So I'm doing it in a really minor way here in terms of encouraging you to text chat, asking the occasional question. We had a poll. There are plenty of other ways that you can do that. But I just say, you know, if it could have been a recording, if there was no point in you turning up live, then why would you? We're all tactical. Students are tactical. They understand when there's no value in getting on a bus, or in this case, just firing up a browser at a particular time. Just for a moment, then I thought we were a year ago. So let's think about this in terms of presence, because this is something I keep mentioning, and I'd like to sort of interrogate this a little bit more closely. There are various forms of presence that go beyond seeing somebody's face, okay? You know, people have social presence, they have a data presence, you can have synchronous presence, asynchronous presence. A really nice little video on this is from this guy, Andrew McAllister. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. One of the reasons I like this video is because he mentions some of my work in the middle of it. But it's a very soothing, he's got such a soothing voice that by about halfway through, I'd sort of forgotten there was a crisis. But he talks about various forms of presence in a really, really useful way that helps expand how we think about it. And I think that that's key to responding to the answer to that first question. You know, what are we missing? I think we're missing presence. And here are some you know, modes of presence: synchronous, asynchronous, collaborative presence, independent presence. So, you know, your students might be working on group work outside of sort of formal taught sessions, but they'll be collaborating a lot. We know that students will form. Yeah, I don't think I can dig the video link out right now, but what we can do, we will provide the slides afterwards. I'm just pausing for a second for my network to catch up a little bit, so I hope you can still hear me okay. So independent, as I say, students will quite often form their own like WhatsApp groups. We have a lot of activity in Instagram around our institution, so we know that students can do that. There's size, obviously, presence. I think that's a really interesting one. So I think this is one we've been really missing, and it's an interesting question as to how you build it back in. Okay, so the reason that perhaps you go and work in a coffee shop or in a library is not because you want to talk to people, but because you want that feeling of people around you, of being somewhere with other people. And a lot of the time, certainly at university, the reason why our students are coming into the buildings is because they want some of this ambient presence. It's not that they need to be there to get that work done. They've got their laptop, they've got the Wi-Fi at wherever they live. They just want to be around people. It keeps your brain alive. Everybody likes that, right? To a certain extent. What's ambient presence online look like? I'd argue that you guys chatting away gently and me seeing that text chat just ticking up slowly is like ambient presence for me. I feel like there are people around, okay? Very motivating for me. But are there other forms of ambient presence we can think about? The next question is presence for what, okay? Now, at my institution, we designed, and this won't necessarily be legible, there's a link there, you can go back through. It's actually legible on my screen just about, but I'm not pretending it's legible. Just to show you an example, we came up with this digital creative attributes framework, and it contains lots of practices and attributes that we think, well, we know, because we asked, that our students want to develop while they're with us. An awful lot of these practices actually involve certain types of connection and presence. They're not just working away on your own. So that's what we did. We have this framework, which is this is why the presence is important from a learning point of view. What I'm going to do now is, yeah, good on paper, in practice not so much. I think it's people have used this framework to reverse design. I suppose you could call it backward design curriculum. So instead of starting with the content that they want to teach, they've started with the practices that they want the students to develop and then work backwards from there. I'm just going to go through some examples of teaching practice that I think sort of speak to this sort of larger ideas that I'm putting out there. This is a portfolio platform called Workflow. It's very visual. All the students can have a space on it. And the reason that I'm showing it to you, this is like the homepage of it, and it just clusters together sort of random open portfolios. I think one thing that's really important is that students can see each other's work. Quite often in a really traditional mode of education, students' work is separate. So if you think about a classic lecture, seminar, essay course, let's say, then the essays tend to be kept separately unless the students figure that out for themselves. We do a lot of visual work. It's great for students to be able to see each other's work developing over time. It makes them feel like they're part of something. Okay, so there's that kind of sense that they're working in and around other people. They could comment on each other's work. You can obviously you can screen share their portfolios into environments like this. But I think coming up with a design of teaching where the students' work is visible to each other, I think is incredibly important when you're all online. Otherwise, it can get very lonely. Here's another example of this. I mean, obviously that previous example could be synchronous. It can be asynchronous. This is, one of these environments. This one's Mural, and this is something that I did at a conference session recently. I think these environments, I don't know if you've been in them before, where we had 30 or 40 people in here, and I left the cursors on, and there were just cursors all over the screen, people responding to these questions, post-it notes appearing. And I call it a creative swarm because it's like this swarm of cursor bees all doing stuff. We were also chatting away in Zoom at the same time. And that really felt like we were all together working on something. Again, synchronous. Not all of these things have to be synchronous, but I think it gave a stronger sense of presence watching those post-it notes appear while we chatted on audio than staring at each other's faces. Okay. Another example, this is from a completely open access online set of seminars, like a seminar series around the concept of teaching complexity. So the complexity of teaching and the idea of teaching the concept of complexity. And we had quite a lot of this whiteboard kind of stuff in where we pose a question. I was tempted to do it today, but I didn't know how many people would be here. And as there's well over 200 people here, this would be chaos, although I quite like that. As you saw you see the answers appearing, really felt like we were really together. It was really a lot of the things, apart from we can smell each other, a lot of the things that came up earlier. in the answer to that first question in chat. Here's a more extreme example of that. I really love this. This is where, I'm not claiming it's a beautiful work of art, but essentially we were hanging around waiting for people to turn up in an online session. There was about 70 of us, and the person running it said, let's just do some drawing. And this is what we came up with. I really like the idea of digital mess. Like, I think sometimes the digital environment can seem a bit anodyne because it's not messy. And this is a really good example of that. We were proud of this. I mean, we'd have printed this out and stuck it on our fridges. That's how proud we were of it. And it just appeared out of nowhere. And by the time the session had officially started, we really, really felt like we were a group somehow. There's a few examples. I'm sure you've got examples of your own. Obviously, there are more specifically asynchronous examples, and I think it's about having a balance of these things. So I've got, here's some more sort of specific examples. So yes, even our old friend email. I'm not suggesting that this is a healthy practice. You can get into all sorts of trouble just having to in email churn, especially if you've got a lot of students. But the point is, if somebody answers your email really quickly, you kind of feel like they're right there. There's some presence there. I think the kind of open office hours approach to forums and chats works really well. But again, it's interesting, isn't it? I've sort of almost super casually used a building metaphor. It's almost impossible to avoid building metaphors. So I've used office hours, but what's an office? Anyway, synchronous sessions with plenty of Q&A. Done a bit of Q&A in this one. Flipped. I won't go into that. I'm sure most people sort of know what that is. I think it's actually a really difficult thing to do well. And I always maintain that lectures should be flipped because in theory, the students have done all the reading, right? So that means when you get to the lecture, you're just explaining stuff and kind of elucidating. Whereas in actual fact, because we tend to assume that the students won't have done the reading, quite often lectures slip back into just talking through the things that they should have read anyway. So I maintain that flipped is not a modern format. It's just one that we've never really done very well. Feedback, we know students love feedback. If you make it text or video, then it becomes like a form of presence. So, if I did a video like that Desituated Art School video that I put up earlier, you're not going to really feel a sense of presence from me in that video because it's just made for an arbitrary audience. But if I made a little video that was saying, oh, I really like the work you've done here, I think you should think about this, that, and the other, it doesn't have to take very long, but you're going to feel like more of a sense of connection. I mean, obviously, you're risking the kind of getting back into the being focused on being able to see people's faces, but it's nice to see people articulate, isn't it? And certainly hand gestures. As you see, there's not many of us can think without waving our hands around. And of course, face-to-face sessions. So, a really important point for me is to not get too focused on any individual session. Now, this is a slightly different case because, we've all come together for a particular seminar that we're doing right now. So this is in a slightly different form. But if we're thinking about the kind of teaching that we're doing with students or with colleagues, then it's quite likely to obviously be like a course or a unit or a module. Everybody's got different words for it. And the real art is not so much the design of those individual activities, but the design of how they connect together and how they flow in and out of each other. I think the most exhausting way of teaching during the pandemic is where a course is largely like, Zoom sessions and email. It's just a very, very hard thing to kind of maintain. It's like you're constantly having to churn it to make sure it's working. At my institution, we insist that courses have a really good structure that they put in the virtual learning environment so that there's a framework for students to go through, and that might go out to synchronous sessions or to forums or to other activities, galleries. We've got Padlet, we've got all those kind of things that you can use, but there's a kind of backbone to it, if you like. So this is a very basic diagram I put together just to kind of explain that principle in as generic a way I could in my own institution. And you can see this could be taking place over a week, could be taking place over a month. It depends on the course. But the point is, you could see a kind of pattern of it going asynchronous, synchronous, a bit of independent, and on it goes. Our approach during the pandemic is to use this model that we call content and contact to make sure there's this balance between the two things. And we've been kind of evolving that into something more sophisticated over the summer. We've got these core practice guides that you can find on our website. We've published them openly. And we also have a learning design workshop that we do, which helps courses to figure out how to design these kind of patterns. Obviously, if you're in a really traditional institution, then that pattern is well established in terms of, a lecture, seminar, tutorial, lecture, seminar, tutorial, lecture, seminar, tutorial, essay, feedback, or whatever it might be. With my kind of institution, there's all kinds of different things happening. But nevertheless, I think what's important is that the things flow together. They make sense as a structure, and the students can kind of understand that structure. It's hard to do well. What we've said, which I think, given the COVID-19, is we've said that clearly your teaching is very likely to contain a certain amount of synchronous sessions. They may be digital or they might be face-to-face. But that's a good way of thinking about it, is to imagine that face-to-face is just another synchronous mode that might be available to you. Then in that way, you can design like an online core to your course, and it will have synchronous moments which might be in Zoom or Teams or Collaborate or whatever it might be. If the opportunity is there, you could switch that so that it's face-to-face. If the opportunity goes away, you can switch a face-to-face session to being an online session. The point is the mode is synchronous. I would argue strenuously that the digital physical divide is actually less important than is the actual mode of engagement with our students. I hope that makes sense. Because doing something face-to-face or doing something digital isn't a mode exactly. It's not as powerful a mode as the way that you're choosing to engage your students, the pedagogy. Okay? Are you asking them questions? Are you asking them to post images? Are you asking them to discuss? Is more important than whether you're in a building or not. Probably not culturally, but certainly pedagogically. Okay? We know that students struggle with the idea of, this is what I was saying at the start in some senses, we know that students struggle with the idea of conceptualizing the idea of an educational institution that doesn't have a building unless that's what they signed up for. Okay, it's a little bit like, and I will share this even though it doesn't show me in a good light, it reminds me of when I turned vegetarian. I'm not a strict vegetarian, but when I started eating vegetarian food, I'd always ask the question, which bit of this is supposed to be the meat? Rather than just going, it's vegetarian food, it's not supposed to be a mirror. I worry that sometimes when we design our online teaching, that we're actually sort of, if we're not careful, we're saying, which bit of this is pretending to be what it used to be like when we were face-to-face? When in actual fact, the digital environment is a different environment, it has different affordances, it has some massive advantages, it has some limitations. So what I want to do is leave plenty of time for Q&A. I don't know what's in the Q&A. I'm going to have a little look. There's nothing in the Q&A, is there? Ah, there is some stuff. It's published, I see. So if you've got any questions for me, put them in the Q&A just while I kind of finish up here. I think just to wrap up, just to give this a bit of a shape at the end, is that, again, I see that the text chat has ploughed on. I'm glad you like the vegetarian food trying to be. I mean, the thing is with vegetarian food is there is a whole market in vegetarian food trying to be like a sausage or bacon to the extent that it gets really ridiculous. The funniest product I had was fishless fingers. What does that even mean? They weren't good. Yes, it's easier to market. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the point I'm about to make, guest 198, which is that I think we need to kind of reimagine how we talk about the concept of education and certainly university. One of the things that we found with a bit of research that we did at my institution was that students really love having recordings of sessions like this available to them because of the flexibility. Makes perfect sense. It's also great in terms of inclusion, accessibility, all kinds of things, especially where there's captions or whatever it might be. People who've got caring responsibilities, they've got jobs, so the flexibility is great. What's really interesting is that it appears that the students don't consider watching a recording teaching. It appears, I want to do some more research in this area, that students mainly consider teaching to be when they can see somebody's face and they're talking at them. And everything else is just independent study, okay? I think we need to, complicate that. We need to blur that somewhat in our minds and in the minds of our students. I think in terms of what constitutes presence and also in terms of what we define as teaching and what we define as not teaching, we need to extend our notions of presence so that we can extend our notions of teaching. Even though people have been teaching online for 25 years or more, I mean, I've been doing it for decades, we still sort of psychologically defining what counts as teaching using a building metaphor and using very limited ideas at present. I think that students actually, I don't want to characterize students as one bunch of people with one thought about this at all. And I think that as students progress through, say, a degree, they come to understand the value of lots of different modes. I think I'm largely talking about incoming students and perhaps their conception of, I'm going to say university, perhaps their conception of university is actually formed through, classic like cultural markers like film and television and fiction. And so this is one of the reasons why students really like lectures, is because you sit in a lecture and even if it's awful, you feel a sense of belonging and you can walk away from it going, I just did 2 hours of university. So, but the extent to which that's an effective way to learn, maybe sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But all of that kind of belonging, connection, all of the things from the first question kind of come for free, right? But when we're online, we need to stretch that. Otherwise, my concern is, I worry that they're kind of, through no fault of their own, I think it's our fault for not articulating this stuff properly, just to be clear. But I think that they're almost slicing out a very particular bit of it and throwing away the rest of it. And so they're not really noticing the goodness of it. Yeah, expectations, that is a really big question. As I say, for new students, I think it's culture, it's a cultural conception. I think the way that we talk about what authentic education is and how we portray that visually quite often reinforces a kind of limited perspective. Okay, so I hope that that was useful. There's a few examples in there, a bit of theory as well, in a way. And I hope, I wanted to make sure that it was really relevant for this very particular moment in time. What we've got 15 minutes, which I'm somewhat surprised at. I've managed to run to time. And so I'm just going to go to the Q&A. And by the way, this is me. I'm just going to go through to the Q&A and I will switch off the slides in a second. Now, so whether it's because it was everybody's favorite question or because you can go to the Q&A panel as well, I suspect. Whether it's because it was everybody's favorite question or just because it was early, Is machine a good analogy for an environment? Got upvoted 6. So I will answer that. I'd say that that maybe a building isn't. I'd say a city is a machine. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. You know, if you're based in London, like my institution is, it feels like a machine. So it can work. Does presence equal engagement? Whoa, thanks guest 728. No. Yes. I suppose I'm more interested in forms of presence that are going to be a more accurate proxy for engagement than others. So I think my point is that a lot of what we like to stick with, a lot of how we define presence doesn't equal engagement. And there are other ways of measuring that. So, for example, you know, like that portfolio platform I showed you, you can literally see how much work the students have done, and they can see if you set it up the way, if you want to set it up that way, you can actually make it so that they can see each other's work as well. And so I think that's a good example of presence equaling engagement. I think what we tend to do is, as you'd expect, in a kind of institutional way, I think we tend to make presence whatever we can measure, whatever's easy to measure, obviously. In terms of the design of courses, I think we got really focused on contact hours. The concept of contact hours in the UK, at least, tends to be how we model courses, because it's also how we model how we pay people. But so what happened was when lockdown hit, we just converted every single contact hour into a session in Blackboard Collaborate or Microsoft Teams. And I don't think that necessarily is, I think that's quite exhausting for everybody. Okay, let's have a look. Could the tools used for these collaborative sessions be shared? Okay. Well, this platform is called Big Marker, and it's a pretty good one, I've got to say. And sometimes it's a question, you know, when you've got a synchronous platform like this, sometimes it's a question of playing with it to find all the angles on it. There were plenty of other things I could have done today, but I didn't want to risk it because I didn't know how many people would be here. But as I say, one of my favorites is just letting everybody go at the whiteboard, even if it creates a mess. Does having the camera on equate to presence? Well, I think hopefully I've been clear in saying not really, and I'd say at least not presence in your mind. You're present in your body, but you're not present necessarily pedagogically. And I'd argue that that is exactly the same when you're face to face. Okay, anybody who's taught will look out at a lecture theatre or a seminar room and will go, "Hey, half of these guys aren't really in the room." I think we have to also be very careful with that when, you know, if we say, actually, we'd prefer people not to look at their laptops or their phones, because the truth is, pedagogically, if they're looking at the Wikipedia page that's something to do with the subject, or if they're looking at the PowerPoint slides or whatever, then they're probably more present in the teaching than they are in the room, if I could put it that way. So my aim with that sort of thing, and I've used shared Google Docs. I really like using that technique. So what you do is, you put a shared Google Doc up on the big screen there's always a big screen with a question on it for students to respond to. And then you ask them either in groups or singly just to go into that document, respond to the question. And a little bit like the text chat here, you just see all these questions appearing. And so that really encourages students to respond because they can see them appearing. And then I will review those questions and I'll pick those answers and I'll pick one out and I'll say, who wrote that? It's really interesting. Could you speak to that question? Could you expand on that? And often the person who starts talking is not the person that would typically talk if you just asked a question point blank to the room, which I thought was intriguing. How do you deal with information overload? I myself struggle to balance all the interesting webinars, conferences, etc. that I can participate at almost no cost with the active work. Well, okay, so here's the thing. I think technology has outstripped us. So technology now has created an environment which we can't keep up with. There's more information that we can take on, there are more opportunities that we can go to. The brakes are off, right? It used to be 20 years ago, you'd go to a building to do work because that's where the work was, bits of paper, whatever it was, okay? When you came home, you probably couldn't do that much work because the work was in the building. So, you know, you'd go to a library to look at books, right? Very, very limited characterization of libraries. You go to so the physical geography of our cities would demarcate the modes of work and the kind of cycle of the day. Now that's all gone. So in actual fact, I think what we're discovering is that we're just not very good at managing our time. When you can do anything at any time, we just immediately exhaust ourselves. So it's just something we've got to get better at, and develop those techniques and tune our students into that as well. So it's an art that needs to be learned and taught because the technological environment, the digital environment, doesn't provide you with those breaks and structures. Okay. Let's have a look. How do we address different learning styles on a digital in a digital environment? So firstly, you have to be cool with the idea of learning styles. And that's a slightly contentious area. I think what I'd say is there's a massive opportunity for that. I wouldn't call it learning styles. I'd call it different modes of engagement. So for example, you know, you could have just been sat listening to this. You could have been text chatting. You could decide to watch the recording afterwards. I think what's interesting to me is that largely the engagement that we developed in our buildings over like 150, 200 years have a very particular mode of engagement. It's like you need to understand that culture, okay? You walk into a lecture theatre. Do you know what the rules are? Maybe not. There are definitely rules, though. Nobody's really told you. When's it okay to talk? When's it okay not to talk? You know, and so this is what I mean about quite often the culture in our buildings is implicit, and you're at an advantage if you're white, middle class, affluent, because that's the predominant culture of a university. And so I suppose I just want to take this moment to point out that buildings aren't inherently inclusive. I think the digital environment suffers from all kinds of problems, but we have got the opportunity to design these different modes, right? And to create scenarios, learning scenarios where students can engage in the mode that they're most comfortable with. So for example, students who have English as an additional language, comfortable in an asynchronous text-based environment because they have more time to shape their ideas. Whereas if you're in a face-to-face environment, or if you're in an environment based on voice, on speaking, then you're at a massive advantage if the main language is your first language, right? So that's an example of what I'm talking about. Let's use the different modes. How can you create true MMO sessions? Miss it, miss out. Oh, I see. Like kind of a FOMO approach to pedagogy. Well, I think the more that you can do that's interactive, Bertrand. So for example, I just said your name, right? So that's like a thing. Like there was you turned up, something specific happened. I wouldn't have said your name. I wouldn't have responded to your question if you hadn't been here. So for me, it's about active learning and it's about moments of interaction. And hopefully the students that then watch the recording go, oh, actually that looked like something that was worth actually being there because it was invented, to use that phrase. Got a few more minutes actually. Do you think designing courses for film or art schools is different than for other teaching based on more literal than practical work? Okay. Yes, no. So here's the thing that I really like about art schools, let's just use that phrase, is that they're fundamentally about critical questioning, about not knowing, about liminality, about taking risk with what you understand, okay? And I think that fundamental pedagogy can apply in any discipline. So you could take, so let's take literature. You could take an approach to teaching literature whereby you're effectively requiring the students to converge on a correct answer, which can quite often happen around a kind of classic canon of texts. It's like, no, this thing, the correct interpretation is blah, blah, blah. Depends what the level of the course is. Or you could teach literature and say, we're going to deconstruct this. We're going to pull it apart. We're going to reinterpret it. We're going to reappropriate it. We're going to put it through a different lens. We're going to look at texts that are written not by dead white guys, etc., etc. So I think there's how can I put it? There's like an arts state of mind that can be applied everywhere. And it's got to do with critical questioning, and it's got to do with being more interested in phrasing, developing, designing really good questions to throw at the world than it has to do with finding a correct answer. Splits a little bit art and design. You know, I'm not saying that's the whole of my institution, but I honestly believe that it's a really powerful pedagogy if you're looking at hopefully your students becoming really active thinking citizens, which, you know, sometimes that depends on your government's views on the extent to which they want that to happen or not. I'm not going to go into that, but you see what I'm saying. How are we doing for time? Do you not think that the word teacher would be better reworked? Learning guide, other? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we like the term facilitator. We quite like the word co. So like, I don't know, co-learner, co-designer. You have to be careful with this because I think it can really upset incoming students, because you can't, sometimes we try and play it both ways, I think, so which isn't fair, where we say, hey, I'm not really a teacher, I'm just another student along with you guys, and then, but I'm also going to mark your work and tell you who's failed. So we have to acknowledge our positionality there. We have to acknowledge our own authority, but having acknowledged it, we can then kind of disrupt it, if you like. So I think that's where I think teacher has quite a lot of baggage in terms of certain modes of expertise and an assumed relationship. So I think it's worth, the language is important, yeah. Let's do a couple more. Is contact time still actually a useful concept or just something else that is misunderstood? I think contact time is a useful concept when you're contracting staff to teach. But just the phrase contact time during a pandemic where you're not supposed to touch anyone, I find sort of ironic. So it's like, we need to make sure we maintain contact hours. But, you know, the one thing that we're not going to have is contact. I know that's not really what it means, it just amuses me. So, yeah, I do think we need to reconsider how we model our courses, not necessarily based on that idea of contact. Because I think contact hours force us back into those limited ideas of presence. As far as I can tell, a contact hour is any time you're in a room with a member of staff. It's not indicative of any kind of pedagogy or mode of engagement. It's just sort of being in the same place. And there are lots of different ways you can be in the same place, be co-present online. Is there a typology of what counts as teaching from a student perspective? I don't know. I feel like there ought to be. I feel like I'd love to come up with one. But I couldn't immediately say in answer to that question. Nothing springs to mind. I mean, if people know it, then they can put it in the chat. I can't see the chat at the moment. Okay, a long one. I'm going to do this long one, and we'll call it after that. In our language, we use phrases connecting physical with understanding. Get a grasp on something, catch an idea. In German, we say, not going to try and pronounce that, begriffen, I did anyway. Any idea how to counterbalance of the unphysical of the virtual, or just accept it and focus on the advantages of the virtual, i.e. easily recorded? Okay, I do have something to say about this very quickly. When you're in a virtual environment, you're also in a physical environment. You're still in your body, right? So I think it's about connecting those two things together. A really nice thing to do is to ask people to draw something. I do a visitor and residence mapping process where people people draw this little map, you know, they scroll on a piece of paper, they take a photo with their phone, they upload it into a Padlet. You can see everybody's terrible handwriting and all the rest of it. You can make stuff, you can take pictures of it, you can blur the boundaries between the physical and the digital. And I think taking those boundaries is always useful. So there's no such thing as being virtual. You're always virtual and physical. You just don't happen to be in the same physical room. And that's one of the reasons why we've managed to carry on as an institution, because you can still make things at home or wherever you have to be. Okay, thank you for all those questions. They were great. Thank you for engaging with the chat and the and as I say, the Q&A and the various questions that I threw at you. This has been recorded. The recording will be made available. We'll make the slides available through Online Educa Berlin as well. As I say, I'm going to be doing keynote on the Friday of OEB, so do sign up, come along for that. There's going to be a ton going on at the conference. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, whatever that means in whichever time zone you might be. And I'm going to sign off there. Cheers, everybody.